Aloha. Welcome to American Issues Take One. I'm Tim Apicella, your host, and today's title is President's Health Condition. Senior Staff Hides the Truth from Us. I'm going to go through a couple of presidents, past presidents and even current. Woodrow Wilson, Ronald Regan, Donald Trump, Joe Biden. Woodrow Wilson had a massive stroke in office. His wife, Edith Bolling Wilson, basically was the communication liaison between a president that had serious health conditions. He was incapacitated. They put him in the back, basically in the back room of the White House, and she became the words and thoughts and mouthpiece for President Wilson. Ronald Reagan, in his later years of his second term, often you can hear Nancy Regan either clutch his hand and whisper what he should be saying. After he left office, he had to admit to the American public that he was experiencing phases of dementia. Donald Trump, the American public was left in the dark for quite a while whether or not he had contracted COVID. He had, and we found out at the very latest moments that he was being rushed to a hospital. And of course, President Biden, we saw him basically unravel during the presidential debate. And now there's a book out called Original Sin by Jake Tapper about what did senior staff know, when did they know it, and should the American public have been known or have been informed on the condition of President Biden. Should there be an age limit on the office of President of the United States? So to discuss that, I have my esteemed guests, Ben Davis, Professor of Law at the University of Toledo. I have Chuck Crumpton, alternate dispute resolution czar and mediator extraordinaire in Honolulu, and my co-host, Jay Fidell. Jay, to you first. This book called Original Sin by Jake Tapper has just come out in the last couple of days. A lot of discussion on the media airwaves about it, and it comes down to this: what did Biden's senior staff know about it? To what degree was he compromised either with mental acuity or in the case of his cancer, his prostate cancer? And should they have been more forthright to discuss it with the American public? Would that have changed the outcome of the 2024 election to say that we would have had a primary? And of course we didn't. Your thoughts about the mental condition and the health condition of either a candidate or a sitting president?
I want to frame my comments with my perspective. My perspective is the country's falling apart. Trump back from the Middle East, which I consider a completely wasted time trip. The first thing he does is he accepts that plane, and now that deal is done, despite all the complaints and contentions and criticism he got when he first announced it. And then you have the big, beautiful bill, which Ben wrote a very good commentary about, which we have posted on our website and our YouTube channel. And so, I think the country is falling apart because when Trump returned to the United States, he seemed to be emboldened in some way, even though his trip was a failure. And he withdrew from participating in the Ukraine talks and leaving Ukraine under the bus. So for Jake Tapper to get up and write this book about original sin, and for the press to have a fiesta over, Biden's misfortune, it just doesn't seem to be the right priority. I'm sorry. The fact is that a lot of this is historical, and the circumstances were different in the days of Woodrow Wilson and, for that matter, Reagan and Biden, of course. Different situation. And I am really wondering from your comments, Tim, how many other presidents kept it from us? Because the one thing we have learned here on ThinkTech in evaluating and examining all these questions about what is the reality, what is truth, is that the media doesn't catch it all. And the people in office don't tell it all. And so what we know is not necessarily the truth. It's not just their physical condition. It's not just their mental condition. We don't know what's going on. And if we examine this, as we will here today, and find that they weren't being, truthful with us over time, for these possibly and other presidents, other officials along the years, no surprise, they didn't tell us. But how is that going to affect Trump? Trump will never tell us anything that he doesn't want us to know. Remember Trump and COVID, I never thought we got any kind of information from that. And today, his administration is limiting vaccines. Oh, my God. Talk about problems in public health. So what I'm saying is that it's interesting from an historical point of view, it's interesting perspective, but the reality is nothing we can learn from what has happened before in terms of the press and these public officials not telling us everything is useful, I'm sorry, with Trump, because we will never know what that guy is doing and how he's feeling and how he is mentally and physically. We try to connect the dots, but it's really hard when the guy lies about everything. That's my perspective.
All righty. Well, let me follow up because, back in the day, we had tradition, we had protocols. They weren't inscribed in law. They weren't law of the land. It wasn't in the Constitution. Yet the media was able to gain access to a few things. One, tax returns of a candidate before they became the president of the United States or highest land in the office in the land. And we also kind of knew about what was going on with their physical health. And we've had Donald Trump brag about how he passes these very simplistic, basic mental acuity tests, basically a test you take before you're allowed into a nursing home. And he brags about how great he scores on those, but there's no way that even gets to the closest bit of whether he has some kind of sociopathic tendencies or not, or other serious mental diseases, or serious physical ailments. We just don't know. And I know you think it's past, but and the world's falling apart. But do all roads go to that point? Do all roads go that maybe the president of the United States is not mentally well? Does it go to the fact that he's not physically or mentally well? And should there be some kind of mandate? I don't know if it's law or whatever, but should there be a mandate that we ought to know that?
Well, we should know that, absolutely. But remember, the 25th Amendment requires a vote of his cabinet, and his cabinet are all lackeys. They're never going to vote to disqualify him. And the press catches what he sends out, like paper towels. The press will never know what is wrong with him. He'd have to fall down flat on his face before the press took notice of it against his specific information. So as much as I would like to say that this is an issue which should be of concern to the public, we're never really going to know. And that's a big problem. Now, mind you, in the past, there have been exceptions to that. Remember FDR? He was in a wheelchair. FDR was a victim of polio when he was younger. Not so young, by the way. In those days, polio hit not only very young kids, it hit older people, older than young kids. And he was handicapped, but the press never focused on it. And I think it's worthy of mentioning that because the press could have really let him have it. The press could have had a fiesta on FDR, but they didn't. They respected him for his competence. They respected him for his sensibilities, and they didn't hurt him with it. Now with Biden, who's not even the president anymore. In fact, when he was the president, the press were having a fiesta with him. And you wonder, how much of that was the press and how much of that was, the lackeys around Trump trying to make Biden look bad. I think this is a distraction. I think the real issue is what is he doing, and we should not be distracted. Finally, one last point, and I'll stop, and that is we are looking for honest people. We are looking for honest people who will reveal their circumstances, who will give us their tax returns, all of that. And the question is, how do we find these people? It's not so easy because everyone who runs or throws his hat in the ring is going to be attacked by Trump, of course, with these schoolyard names, but also by the media. It was a slow news day when Tapper released his book, and they focused on that. It was a slow news day when Biden revealed he had prostate cancer. And so you have a fiesta. We don't need a fiesta. We need the truth.
Okay, thank you. Ben, I'm going to take you down memory lane here, and that's at the end of Donald Trump's first term. We had a general, I believe he was the chief of staff, who was very concerned about the mental condition of the President of the United States, so much so that he called China and said, don't worry, we're not going to do anything to rock the boat here. I'm going to have everything go through me. That's pretty serious. And my point is, to what degree, do generals or the chief of staff or the members of his cabinet step in and say, we've got a loose cannon here who has his finger on the button, the atomic bombs.
Right.
So this goes to my point again. I know Jay thinks this is a distraction, but it goes to my point is, why do we not fix this problem? What is the big mystery about having some serious batteries of mental tests and physical tests to take place before someone becomes the President of the United States or is in the office of President of the United States?
Can you define we? When you say we, do you mean the castrated Congress? What do you mean, we?
Yes, because I think it has to be in the form of a law. But remember, who influences Congress ultimately? We, the American people.
So I would say a couple different things. First, since you're bringing up the question of Congress, well, let's take Dianne Feinstein. Okay, Dianne Feinstein was a senator. She was missing for a lot of last 3 years. She was missing everything. Everyone around her knew that she was declining, but no one would tell her to, it's time for you to resign, right? If you can look on the Supreme Court, there are really Supreme Court people have been appointed to the court for life. And, there have been occasions, I remember reading about it, where, maybe one of the justices would go see another one and say, you really need to step down. And that was the only person that the justice would listen to step down because of health. So this is, I think, a more sort of deep issue of sickness being considered equivalent to weakness in our country in ways that are really leading to this kind of reality. For example, with regards to, just to take Biden now. So what they're saying is that he didn't know that he had prostate cancer until last Friday, I think it was, right? Then you find out that they say that he hasn't had what's the standard test for this called a PSA since 2014. That's 11 years ago. Mm-hmm. And, I look at that and I say, how is it possible that the doctors that he had for all those years didn't give him a PSA? Because the change in the number on the PSA is not necessarily perfect, but it's a big signal to really do a biopsy and see what's going on. And the idea that a man of his age, from 67, 68, or 80 or whatever it was, would have not had a PSA test by any doctor that he had is outrageous, quite honestly, in terms of medical stuff.
I don't believe it. Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, the other thing is that if we talk about prostates, because let's get to prostates, we're all four guys here, all right? You remember Lloyd Austin as Secretary of Defense, right? He had some kind of operation related to his prostate. And you remember how there was that whole hullabaloo about whether he had revealed or handed over his authority to somebody else while he was having the operation, right? And so you could say, yeah, he should have done it. But, men can be very, very sort of, how can I describe it? A little, not intimidated, but a little hesitant to talk about things like having a prostate cancer. It's a kind of cancer that goes to virility, goes to all kinds of things of sort of manhood, right? 15 years ago, I got diagnosed with prostate cancer. my father died of it back in 1993. And so, I was confronted with that because of why my PSA went from a number like 2.5 to 3.5. I mean, it's like minimal, but that prompted the biopsy, and they did the little snips, and they're like, oh, look at this, there's some stuff in there. And then you have choices you have to make, right? So that moment, what fascinated me about it is I was trying to figure out what approach to take. And I probably talked to 20 men who had various types of treatment for prostate cancer. I know more about those men's private parts than anything else about them, I want to tell you. And they were very open as men to men, talking about the different things that happen, you see? But that's not something I expected, because I've been built on sort of, I'm going to be macho and all. But it was beautiful for me. It was really beautiful to have these men really share all kinds of things to help me with my decision as to which approach to take. So, and maybe I should add another thing. Some people criticize Donald Trump. They say he wears Depends, right? Well, guess what? I wear Depends because that's one of the consequences of prostate cancer, all right? And so, but this kind of pejorative vision of people who wear Depends, I think there are lots of older people who wear Depends, and it's part of the reality that they have to deal with the way that their body is. But, we're not allowed to be that. We're not allowed to be that human, right? And to have frailties. We're supposed to, and that's certainly true with regards to our politicians. And of course, I should add the last thing about the hiding stuff. I mean, one of the things that really struck me is that, what was it? Strom Thurmond lived to be 100 years old, right? And it was only after he died, after all his Dixiecrat stuff and all that, that I found out that he sired a black kid back when he was 16. So literally for 84 years, no one mentioned this in the press. No one. Think about that. What kind, wouldn't that have been relevant if there's something with regard to somebody talking about segregation to know that about him? I thought it would have been relevant,
I think it does say, if you're the president of the United States, your privacy is going to be compromised. If you don't want your privacy compromised, and I don't care if it's Senate, House of Representatives, President of the United States, then don't run.
Right. And I do think it is owed to the American people. I just think if it's true what they say about Biden not having had a PSA since 2014,
I don't buy that.
That is a tragedy. I'm going to say to anybody watching this who is a person over 40 years of age and a man, get a PSA. If you
I know for a fact that when you have what is called a rainbow blood test, it's a rainbow. They collect everything all at one time. You might have 15 little tubes, but guess what? One of those tubes is a PSA. Yeah. Okay, thank you, Ben. Chuck, to be president of the United States, you have to be at least 35 years of age. Should there be an upper age limit?
I think that's part of a larger question. But I think where Jay's and Ben's initiative and yours take us first, there may be three things that we should take a look at. One is not in the last month or even year, but in the first year and two after Trump took office. In 2017 and 2018, dozens of psychological and psychiatric experts did detailed analysis of his behaviors, communications, records, history, family history, everything. And there was general agreement that he manifested the symptoms of three significant disorders. Okay, narcissistic personality disorder, delusional disorder, and dementia. That was 7 and 8 years ago by experts. We had that information. And as Jay pointed out, since that time, the press has basically sane-washed it. Second, look at Trump's communications and behaviors, not from a political point of view, but how aberrant is it for a person of his age and education and position of responsibility to say and do the things that he's done, including taking a plane that Qatar business has been trying to get rid of through the government for almost that same 7-8 year period. So we have it in his behavior and in the fact that when he does it, those that he's handpicked for loyalty come to his defense and say, no, it's okay. There's a reason for that. It's not aberrant. Together, they have been normalizing those psychologically disordered behaviors. And the third thing is, of course, the consequences of it. Look at where the consequences are inflicted. They're not on the perpetrators of waste, fraud, and abuse, which we know occurs at the greatest extent at the highest levels with the greatest impacts. They're instead inflicted on the beneficiaries of the programs that Congress put there to try and provide some health, social, educational safety net to those in society that were most vulnerable, most undervalued, and most underserved. Look at those three things.
Judges have age limits, mandatory requirement. To my question again, should there be an upper age limit for the President of the United States? And if you think no, then why? And if you think yes, why?
Following again your, Jay's and Ben's insights, there are a number of factors that should be subjected to careful, neutral, objective, reputable expert evaluation for candidacy, just as you would have if you were going to put someone in a position of extremely great authority and influence and effects. Age would be one. Mental, emotional history and psychological health and evaluation would be another one. But the other is the behaviors and the actions of that person. What do they signify and who do they impact? And are those things that comport with the health and best interests of the people who most need the service that person is intended to provide?
Okay. Thank you very much, Chuck. Jay, like a dog with a bone, I'm not going to let this one go. Your thoughts about an upper age limit for the President of the United States? Yes, no, good idea, bad idea?
Oh, good idea, good idea. You know, for law firms, not that this is relevant to Trump's fight with them, but a lot of law firms have upper limits. And in fact, Justice Mark Rechtenwald is retiring because he's about to hit 70. And the law firms that I'm thinking of, they have an age like 70 where you have to retire. There are exceptions, I suppose, but for the most part, these are enforceable limits. And why 70? Well, because at the time somebody was selecting that number, people were more likely than not to develop physical and mental problems after the age of 70. Now that may in fact have changed because we have a longer expectancy. We have theoretically better medicine, although right now I would say our better medicine is declining. Thanks to Kennedy and the like. But there should be an age where the probabilities do not favor, the competence of the individual, either physically or mentally. And I would add, by the way, as you read about it all the time in the paper, you could be 30 and die. You could be 40 and get a chronic disease. You could be 50 and be complete and have early Alzheimer's and so forth. So there's no guarantee here. It's only a probability. And I guess what I'm concerned about is how do you determine that probability today? Maybe it should be 75. Maybe it should be 65, given the decline in our healthcare. And the other thing is there's a subjective element that you guys are talking about. How do you decide that this individual is not likely to be able to perform. How do you look, for example, Chuck, at his conduct in the past, his behavior, what he's done in his life, and decide, oh, he's declining. He can't possibly be competent to be president of the United States. And who does that? And my old question about who does that? A Democrat? A panel of Democrats and Republicans? How about the Libertarians? How about the Independents? Are they on that panel? How about the doctors? I mean, this is going to be very hard because why? Because it's not just medical, it's subjective. I hate to tell you this. I want to tell you this sotto voce, Tim, sotto voce, that psychology and psychiatry are often imperfect and they are subjective. So not all psychiatrists will agree, not all psychologists will agree, not all people will agree as to whether an individual is on a track where he is going to become competent. But I would add this before I stop, and that is, I believe that everybody running for public office ought to go to Politics 101, whether it be in high school or college. UH ought to offer a course in Politics 101. And for the same analysis, everybody ought to have a physical exam. And they ought to turn over their tax returns. Remember that issue with Trump. But they don't have that. They don't have to know anything about politics. They don't have to have a physical exam. They don't have to tell us the truth about their condition, mental or physical, or their experiences that might help us understand. And you know, it's a black box, and we never find out, even if the individual is really at great risk for pushing the wrong button at the wrong time. And that's what we have now. And I firmly believe that he is declining. But I also believe that the loyalists around him will hide that from us, no matter how much he declines. They will never invoke the 25th Amendment. And we will have a non-president president for at least part of his term. And we will never know about it. This is the worst possible result.
All right. My response to your response is molto bene. Okay, Ben. There's a lot of criticism about what did senior staff know about Joe Biden and when did they know it? There is, I think, a fairly logical argument that had this been known to the powers to be in the Democratic Party, there would have been a stronger pushback on him deciding he wanted to run again. But because it was, don't look here, nothing to look at here, just keep on walking, and clearly probably some shading of the truth or hiding the truth, we ran out of time as far as the Democratic Party. There was no primary because there was not enough time for a primary.
Right.
Now, I understand about health conditions basically blowing up and blowing a candidate out of the water. I'm reminded of George McGovern and his vice president pick of Senator Eagleton, who had depression, and that was disclosed, and that was the end of Senator Eagleton. He didn't last another day after that disclosure. So, I mean, there's that sensitivity, but is the criticism valid? Regardless of its, one's private health issues or his mental health issues, is the criticism that you could really throw the whole party out of whack, and as a result, we now have Donald Trump. Isn't there an argument for this criticism?
Sure, I think there is. And, as I'm listening to you talking about personal health, what popped into my head was, what is it called? FERPA. The whole idea of the privacy with regards to your own health information. HIPAA and all that stuff. Okay. So, the privacy with regards to your own health information that, was sort of supposed to be sacrosanct, right? So then the question for me was like, as we get up to the president of the United States as the person and not the office, the person, do they have HIPAA rights, in terms of disclosures about who they are and their health? Is that an area that we would want them to be able to make the decision to disclose or not, right? Or are we going to have a system where there is a required, it's not constitutionally required, and it might even be considered unconstitutional. I think if Congress were to make that a requirement for someone to run for office, to have the kind of thing that we're talking about. Where do we end up with that notion of the privacy of your own health situation? Now, the second thing is, say that you are one of those senior staff and you know there's a problem. Is your duty under your oath to disclose it? And that under the oath you have to take, against foreign and domestic enemies, and the Constitution. Would you have a duty to disclose? I think that you could argue that if you were aware of something being wrong, I think even the duty to disclose of that senior official could be reasonably seen to be something that should have been done.
What worries me there is if one member of the senior staff has information about, say, the president, he has power over the president, doesn't he? He can tell or not tell. There's a possibility for gross corruption there.
Yeah, that's true too. That's true too. So where does that leave us, right? Does that leave us with what we have now, which is a mess, and it's unsatisfactory? Where do we end up?
Questions, I guess, we're yet to ponder, because I don't think we came to a consensus here, and that's okay. That's good. And really the question hasn't been resolved. So with that, let's go around the table. Jay, I'll start with you on your final thoughts on this topic.
I really appreciate this conversation. It's important, but it's at the end of the day, it's not going to have any effect on Trump. It teaches us that we really ought to examine these candidates more carefully. Their job is to not tell us things, to package themselves. Trump is a brand experience, right? He's been doing that since the days of The Apprentice. He's going to package himself in the most positive way, and he's not going to tell us anything that undermines that brand. But the fact is that we need to know. And so and I guess that we in this context means the media, have to press in on him, no pun intended. And they have to ask him, what's your physical condition? You have to share your medical records with us. You must do that. All candidates must do that. You have to tell us what's wrong with yourself, if anything. And you have to share your grades in school too, by the way. He didn't share anything. And the press never got him to do it. And the people never got him to do that. We might have voted differently had we had that information. So I lay this, I'm afraid, as so often we do, on the media. They went along to go along. They were afraid that he would criticize them. They were afraid that the Republican Party, such as it has evolved, would criticize them. But we need a more aggressive press on this very issue. And that's the bulwark. That's the bulwark here. It isn't the castrated Congress that's going to help us.
Thank you. Chuck, your final thoughts.
I get this feeling that the basic principle of decision-making, action, and the rules and processes and the people who govern it need to have an objectively reliable element of risk analysis and guardrails. The greater the risk of harm, the more severe and long-term the harm, the greater the guardrails and the protections need to be against it. That's a pillar of what's supposed to be our legal system, and it's been completely ignored in what's going on right now. So we somehow need to restore that.
Yeah, I think access to the nuclear football is definitely in need of a guardrail. Thank you, Chuck. I think it's a wonderful way to end the comments. Thank you. Appreciate it. Ben, you get to go to third base and round a home.
So one thing that occurred to me was that, how when people run for office, there may be their party or some group wants them to sign a pledge, right? Like, I pledge that there'll be no taxes. It's for the American tax union, right? None of those things are requirements under the Constitution, right? So I was thinking, well, maybe this may sound crazy. All of the parties could insist on the things that we're talking about of anybody who is going to put themselves forth as a candidate, because they're private entities, they're not governmental. And that would be the way that you would get there. Now, granted, that could be a little difficult, to get our parties to do anything, right? But it just seemed that might be a way to, put in place an obligation to reveal those kinds of health issues, tax issues, all that stuff. And if somebody didn't comply, the party could say, we're not going to allow you to be nominated by it,
Well, in the last year, I've heard some pretty strange things coming out of politics. They're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs, they're eating the pets from the people that live there. That's how I came up with this topic. So I'll leave it at that. I want to thank my esteemed guests, Ben Davis, Chuck Crumpton, and my co-host, Jay Fidell. I'm Tim Apicella, your host for American Issues Take One. Join us next week, and until then, aloha.